Welcome, welcome. As people are arriving, we welcome you to the second conversation hosted by the NAACP on Albina, our Albina, not just development that is going forth in Albina or projects, but the community that we hold dear. And this is our opportunity to actually engage in conversations that move the conversation about what is possible and what can happen. Do a quick little housekeeping. Oh my goodness.
She wanted to be on the camera. So
I don't blame her. The earlier you start, the better our outcomes. I'm doing a housekeeping, make sure my phone is on silent. I encourage everyone, if they have phones close to them or are using it, to make sure that we're on mute as we go through the conversation. We will start in a few moments. Just give a few moments for people to be able to arrive. And I don't know. Oh my goodness. Look at that face. I know you're tickled. I am too.
say hi, Miss Sharon.
What's your name?
She calls herself baby still.
I
Her
don't
name is
blame
Zuri,
you.
but she calls herself baby. She says, I am baby. When you tell her, hey Zuri, I am baby, she'll correct me. So
It works in the family, doesn't
I guess
it?
so.
We all are somebody's baby, we hope. All right. I just want to remind us that we are recording this session. We do that so that we actually make sure we capture all the important conversation, but also it allows us to prepare for subsequent conversations, to pick out salient points, to make sure we got the critical ideas and the sharing that help us frame subsequent conversations. And that's one of the commitments of the leadership of the NAACP is to find out what do the people want? And as the old song said, you got to give the people what the people want, and it's opportunity and safe space for critical conversations. A couple of housekeeping ideas as we go forth. As you come on, please put in the chat your name, your pronouns, and answer our leading question. What is albina? What does albina mean to you? If you're a newcomer, transplant to Portland, how did you hear about albina or have you heard about albina? And what does that mean to you? And I'm going to model that as our other panelists. All right. Couple of more tips. Again, for those of you who might just be joining, I noted that we are recording the session and we use it primarily as an opportunity to review the questions that were asked and the responses that were raised, and to help us consider and frame subsequent conversations with the community. If you're discomforted by being recorded, if you'd put that in the chat so that you can be assisted in an alternate way to be a part of the conversation, or you might want to put things in chat and not necessarily speak them out loud, but we want to honor and respect everyone's right to be present in a way that's comfortable. We also have a typical acknowledgement not only of the land that we are sitting and standing in here in Multnomah County, in Portland, in Oregon, in the West Coast. And we also, the NAACP, the acknowledgement was crafted by Mark Herrera, who was a former chair of the Public Policy Committee. And then we have the diasporic acknowledgement and recognition of Black people in Oregon that was crafted by our second Vice President, Donovan Smith. And we read those, we lead off in our general meetings, our committee meetings with those readings. I would encourage you today, if you're interested, to go to the website of the NAACP, which is pdxnaacp.org, and click on those two references. They're very powerful and they're very um, engaging ways for us to center ourselves as African American, Black, diasporic people. We have a number of questions, 20 or more, that were submitted in advance, which says a lot about the community's interest in conversing with and finding responses and opportunities to participate in moving forward in Albina. And we really appreciate them. I want to get to them as soon as possible and as often as possible. You can also use the chat box. Please use it not only to raise your hand and to be recognized, but to also put in questions that we may or may not be able to get to today, but we certainly will look to have them answered. And then also, you can have emotions, you can cheer, you can do a smiley face, use the reactions. Please do that. And then also, if you have a specific question you want to direct to the panelists who I'm going to introduce to you now, please do so as well. We'll go to that panelist that you might have identified and then allow others to be able to speak as well. Let me now take the time to introduce our panelists to you. We have in the box that you see two people sitting in. We have Cleo Davis and Ken Talton Davis. I know them best as amazing creative artists. They are archivers of our experiences. They do amazing work and installations. If you've been on Alberta, you need to stop at those large, beautiful red obelisks, and you need to read about folks that you've seen, that you've talked to, that you elevate and hold up in community, that it's a reminder that we are present all over this city and this state. And also, I don't often say it, but if you're walking up Williams Avenue for at least 20 or 30 blocks, you need to look down. Now, that's a practice where you have to make sure you're safe, but you need to look down at the coins that they have installed in the sidewalk that tell the stories, that remember, that capture African Americans, the Black experience here in Portland. And if you see sidewalk patrons who are noshing and enjoying themselves on our Williams Avenue, you need to encourage them to look down as well, because the stories weave together the community. They are also instructors who are teaching different urban planning theory and acknowledgement in our university. And so I'm really excited to introduce both of them, who are the artists who are working with Albina Vision Trust and doing the graphics, doing the work of engaging community in a lift to figure out what we want to have happen. Just above them is Andre Lightsey Walker. Just met him, but I love that he's a policy transformation director. And that is with the Street Trust, which is a nonprofit that's really looking at different transportation options, not only safety, but a multitude of options that make us less car dependent, make us safe, whether it's bicycling or walking through community, and looking at the future in the present. He's also an urban planning graduate from Portland State University's renowned School of Urban Planning. So, welcome, Andre. We're glad to have you as well. And then I have the pleasure of introducing one of my favorites, and that is Fahim Akwe, who's known as Max Smith. This brother is a hip hop artist, a creative journalist who's been recognized for his writing about Black Lives Matter and movements for liberation and justice in the community. You've probably seen him in a lot of spaces over the last year or more. And what I remember most about him, he's the editor of We Out Here, a hip hop journal, but he also is made famous or infamous, he might say, by other journalists capturing his conversation in the middle of protest with Mayor Ted Wheeler. And that interview conversation, I'm calling it, went viral. And he appeared in everything, including the New York Times. And so it's a pleasure to introduce our chair of the NAACP's Black Liberation Committee, Mac Smith. Thank you, Mac. So now we're going to get started. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. Normally, in our meetings, Donovan Smith would take on this responsibility and honor. We want you to step up or step back. We want you to actively engage in the conversation with us. We want you to feel like your question matters. But if you find that your question is a little bit lengthy, or you have a number of questions that seem to be rolling at the same time, if you could ask your question, first be recognized either by raising your hand or putting it in the chat that you want to speak. And we're going to try to pay attention. I'm going to be assisted in that, making sure that we recognize what appears in the chat. Let someone else speak, or others who've not spoken. We encourage you to step up, and then we'll make sure we come back to someone who has a number of good questions they want to raise. And I want to remind again that we received nearly 20 questions in advance, and we're going to try to go through them. They are rich. Some are very complex, as can be expected from our people. And we are going to try to go through those questions first by me putting them to the panelists, but also opening them up so there can be rich dialogue in this conversation. Lean into ambiguity. Every asked question does not have an answer that might be the answer you're looking for initially. But realize that we want to engage. We want to know what matters. That's been the work of the NAACP, and certainly Albina Vision Trust and other organizations, to give space that is safe for Black people to really ask the questions they've been pondering, or those that don't get answered in other places that we might be raising our hands. And then also, we want you to consider things that might happen in the moment so that your comfort, if you're discomforted, if the answer, if other questions are asked, take time for yourself to pause, to think about it, to determine if you want to respond, or if some questions you just want to honor the fact that it's a question that someone else wants to ask. We want this to be an engagement, a conversation. It's not a debate or an argument. And all of the questions are not going to satisfy all of us based on where the answers might come from. But we don't get a lot of chances to ask the questions, the risky business in other spaces, and we want that for us. So let's begin again. And then at the end, I will not only remind you of whether or not a conversation 3 is necessary, and the NAACP will take that before the executive body and really determine how we can continue to extend this opportunity. I do want to encourage you all to pay attention to the joint meetings on the I-5 project. And at the end, I will name the next meeting, and that's coming up, where the three primary committees that one of the questions asked about, are we participating in the I-5 project specifically around ODOT, and give people an opportunity to observe and to ask questions in those larger decision-making bodies. Now to the questions this morning. The first question is reclamation of inner Northeast Portland safe for the Black community? For example, the rallying of white supremacists and far-right affiliates isn't the first time, nor is it the last time in close proximity to our community. Should we be focusing on the Albina area? Why not Delta Park, Rosewood, Rockwood? Would any of the panelists want to start with that? Perhaps Mac? You're on mute.
Well, thank you. That's a good question. I think off top, there's a historical background that comes in with Albina that's a bit more recent than some other things in our history, but also it's recent enough that it still is touching us. I've done some work and some following through with the EDPA too, and really spent some time to learn about the history of the damages done in that area. I'm not per se personally a fan of really trying to lean into places that we are being forced into based on gentrification. I personally live in the numbers in East County. I would rather not, be deep out here. I would much rather be back in our natural space. And that's my take on it. You're on mute.
Other panelists? I see the smiles. We can move on. That's no problem.
I'll pop in just really quickly.
Certainly.
I think this is supporting Mac's vision as well. There is value in central location within cities. And so we also want to make sure that there are job opportunities for the Black community as well, so that we can be accessing the benefits of being central. And that's why we were pushed to Albina actually originally, is, so much of our relationship to American urban spaces is labor. And so I think just having that access and the access to the resources that are developed in that community already is a reason to focus there. But I think it's also going to be important to make sure that we are dispersed at this point. And so recognizing that as well is going to be very, very important as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Another question. Did you want to lean in?
Please, yes. I would agree with also what the two other panelists has said. Albina is not just a historical legacy for us, but it is also a place that we were pushed out it is some of the most wealthiest land in the state. So if we continue to be pushed out of things that we've built, things that are wealthy and that allow us to be prosperous, we'll end up with nothing, kind of like how we are now. So this is what the fight is about. So, Black folks in many cities develop or populate wealthy lands, and we're being pushed out. So that's what that, to me, what that one of the fights would be. And these are our homes.
Thank you very much. Following some of that question, the displaced Black community in East Portland is facing the eviction crisis. If we presently don't have the resources to keep ourselves sheltered, why are we focusing on developing housing and improving an area of town the majority of our community no longer lives in? panelists?
I think this one goes well with the last question, as far as why Albina and the safety and looking at these areas that are further outside of the central city. As we look at the economics of being pushed out into areas like the Numbers, Delta Park, and really truly dispersed around the city and even over into Vancouver, the more that we're able to focus on something that is more centralized and pull those resources together, the stronger that that can make a community, and it can make that basis for being able to support each other and really having some of that economic growth that might not be available elsewhere. If your Black businesses are all over the city, which is great to have them all over and wherever we are, but if you were to say have a neighborhood that really kind of focused on Black entrepreneurship, well, again, people are able to really kind of pull together and focus those economics on building each other, building themselves, and really kind of building those economics and community.
There can be strength in numbers if it's organized.
I know that there is a great deal of dispersal. I knew when I lived out in Park Rose, I remember way back in the day before Black people began to move towards Park Rose when the inner city became more and more unaffordable, that back in the day, the idea of going out past 82nd, even 82nd was a real reach. But to imagine people living, I lived on 148th, down from, Glendoveer golf course, is like, who in the world goes out there, pack a lunch? And so when I moved to 181st, it was like nobody comes to visit because they said we meet you at Lloyd Center, or we'll meet you when you come back to church, or you're shopping for beauty supplies. And I realized what that said about a core, a space, a centralized space where we would meet up, where we would see each other, where we would socialize, and how isolating, because we didn't have the numbers out in the numbers then. So as a Black person, that sense of displacement and who's going to come see you, who are you going to see in the neighborhood, where are we going to feel a sense of place and space, is critical to where we try to congregate and in a space where we belong. So I thank you all for the question responses, and I certainly thank the questioner for the question. There is a question: what is the role of the NAACP on this project? Are you part of larger discussions on the hybrid 3 options? Now, that refers specifically to a number of options that were offered in ODOT's plan, the Oregon Department of Transportation, the plan for the expansion, for the rebuilding, for the improvement, that's their terminology, of I-5 as it passes through the Rose Quarter area, the same area where our community was decimated, in fact, back in the 60s. And the question, the response to that is the NAACP's role continues to be advocating, pushing for community to be informed, engaged, and mobilized around what is best for us as a Black community that was displaced intentionally. It also is to advance colored people, which is the historical mission of the NAACP, and that is in education, in economics, in housing, in health, and for us in the 21st century, toward Black liberation. So yes, we're always interested and active about getting the word out, signaling, and ensuring that people know what's going on. But specifically, was appointed to the Historic Albina Advisory Board, HAAB, which is a body of folks, Black people, who represent either displacement. I'm a legacy child of the displacement from Albina, who have who have long engagements in run community-based organizations, and or active residents in the conversations. That's one. I also was selected by the governor to sit on the newly formed advisory group that was able to craft some movement, because we were all stuck on which of the options for the Rose Quarter would prove most beneficial to the community. So this hybrid theory, there were about 5 options that a cover assessment group had come up with. And we were a part of those conversations and continue to be so. There is the Historic Albina Advisory Board. There is the Community Oversight Advisory Committee, and we have members and others who happen to be on those bodies. And there is also the Executive Steering Committee of the Department of Transportation. We were meeting independently, but over the last month or so, we have been meeting jointly. And that's where you had the three bodies and then all the state planners and all were involved in this project. So we have historical involvement in anything that has to do with the Black community. And then we have specific involvement by being seated on some of these committees that are actually engaged in the process of what this I-5 project is really going to be about. Hope that answers it. Is there anything that any of the panelists would like to add to that? Moving forward, there is a question in the that was submitted early on. Air quality impacts of the proposed I-5 expansion project prompted Governor Kate Brown and the Portland Public School Board to recommend moving Harriet Tubman Middle School. Does that change members' support of this project? And I think for our audience, does that change our support? Someone's asking. The second part of that question, if Tubman needs to be moved, do we need to address air quality issues at all schools, especially in the impacted communities of color, such as George Middle School on North Columbia Boulevard? Are there responses to that? I think it's a very good question about air quality and emissions and the impact on our students, not only their learning, their safety, but the air they breathe. And there has been a commitment that Tubman, that sits literally in the lion's mouth, if you will, that it needs to be moved. And the question is, does that mean the area, reclaiming that area is actually a good idea, is what I'm hearing. Are there responses to that?
I'll start. The first thing I think I want to point out is the fact that this is just now being discussed. That freeway has been poisoning that area for decades. And so I think that's something we need to recognize. I also think we need to recognize that the Department of Transportation is implementing projects through communities that are increasing emissions into these communities. And so I think we should just be critical about the type of projects that we're supporting and ensure that there's mitigation strategies involved.
You mentioned, Andre, that there's the introduction of projects that could have the same kind of bad air quality or emission releases. Can you name one or two of those projects that people might want to be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think any freeway expansion project is intended to increase the amount of vehicle travel. And my understanding is that there's no plan to reduce that. And so there is a large project that is taking place in between Portland and Vancouver. And
Yes.
and it's framed as a replacement of a bridge for earthquake safety foundationally. But the design is not that. We'll say that. So
Is it to move more traffic?
Yes,
Because
exactly.
of the number of people now that move, that are, the community where you live and you work in Portland. So the back and forth is increased significantly.
Yes. And so I think as a community, as a Black community, it's important for us to start to imagine new ways to move through space. Autocentrism, or the centering of the automobile in American Western framework as being this epitome of freedom, was actually what decimated our community. Black people became subsidiary to automobiles, basically, and they said, we're going to build a pathway for automobiles through your established homes and communities. And so I think it's very, very important to us to create realities beyond what we've been fed and trained to believe. And so that's all I want to put out into the conversation at this moment.
Thank you. Thank you. And also for people who are, for participants, if you want to put in the chat again or raise your hand, trying to pay attention, and I might lean on Donovan Smith because he's so good at this to kind of track if anybody puts something in the chat and I miss it, please feel free to engage in the conversation. And Mac, if he responds to me inappropriately, I know you'll catch that. The question now that we're moving to is, how do we reach out and include the displaced Black community that is now in the numbers? And I want to also raise, I think this question should go to Cleo and Kane, because there has been active participation of Eastsiders in conversations and workshops that have happened over the past year. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, yeah, I think that one of the main ways of reaching out would be, it's within our 50-year plan that we have for Albina. So, looking at Black folks from all around the Portland metropolitan area and continuing to have these community dialogues that include all of us to see how we want to move forward with the development and prosperity of Lower Albina and Albina in general. One of the things specific to, like, let's say East County would be looking at, anything from housing to entrepreneurship, and looking at how do we utilize the space that 94 acres that we're looking at developing. So, maybe not all folks want to come back and live, and maybe it's like a workplace situation. So these are all questions that, and maybe they want to live. So, so then we can look at, housing, work and entrepreneurship, as well as entertainment in general. So these are all the things that are on the table that as a community, we need to come out to these workshops and begin to decide before we start designing and developing in this area. Anything you'd like to add?
And I think just to add one more layer of that is also the opportunity for investment. Many people may not think that they're able to make investments, but I think having a variety of ways that people can do just that within Albina, and really kind of building that bridge from the central parts of the city out to East County. And again, revitalizing both, again, recreating that community space that has been so dispersed.
Thank you. And I also would note is that there were several active Eastside participants who, when I was involved in the workshops with Albina Vision Trust, asked for Albina Vision Trust or some of us to come out and to sit in meetings that they are convening to help them move their inclusion in the process of project development, because there's a lot of it going on out in the East Side, and the same situation of how we're excluded or included is being played out again. And so I thought that was very notable. Can you come and sit down and allow us to be in meeting where the questions can be answered, or at least the thinking about what the question should be that we need answers to. And so the follow-up on that, since we're recording, I'll remember that and we'll capture that as well. Thanks. And then there was the question asked, why has only one organization, Albina Vision Trust, been mentioned when there have been older organizations fighting gentrification and representing the community that are Black-led? Now, of course, I will ask the AVT panelists who are present to answer that. But I think what's important is to hear the question says, there have been older organizations fighting gentrification and representing the community, which we know we've been having these conversations, these discussions, and responding to our eviction from our homes and community for a long, long time. And so if you two would lead off a response to that, then I certainly would want Mac and Andre as well, and audience members to respond.
Um, well, I think the biggest part of that is that in the most recent years, Albina Vision Trust has really made some moves that have been fairly notable, and they're presenting really a different way of going about things than what tends to be the kind of standard planning. And in that, it is also a matter of studying what these other organizations have been doing, what their successes have been, what has worked, what maybe could have worked out a little bit better. And not only learning from that, but trying to put it in the framework of this is what's been happening over the last 100 years of Black community here in Portland. This is what people have been fighting for over these 100 years of Albina as the center of the Black community here. And these things need to change. And I think putting that energy into it really kind of brings forth some additional energy from the community and from everybody who's involved. And I think people are ready for that kind of big push and really kind of, and seeing that it can be done, and that even though for some the changes might not be big enough, for others, they're really big steps. And they are steps that perhaps, or that will lead to other larger steps to create, again, that space that is a vision of Black community, of Black joy, Black safety and spaces. And just looking at some of the other plans, these things have been incorporated, and so many pieces get picked off by other plans by the time they're submitted to cities or by the time they're ready. With the energy that's behind what Albina Vision is working on is definitely just that little bit different. And I think it's time. I think more people are ready as well.
Would you say that Albina Vision Trust, that vision, is actually the elevation of, the inclusion of, the learnings of these 100 years of fighting against, pushing, asking for change, expecting to be at the table? So the evolution of our fight to reclaim and to establish that we are active in the conversations about what happens in our community. This is the 2021 opportunity to gather, to gain, to learn, to move forward. And I'm
Yes.
assuming all groups, anyone
Yes.
who's working on this, it's in the chat. Donovan Smith offered Beyond Black CDC, while it's in the early stages of realizing the vision, has committed to being a community development corporation. One of the pieces we're talking about around governance and having a say and having control of the community for East County, specifically for Black folks who are out there. So not only check for Donovan, if there's any contact information, share Beyond Black CDC, which is representing the development of a community development corporation in East County. And that's good information to share. Are there other responses to the question of 100 years of fighting for us to have stake in control of Albina, the land that was our community? And still, Albina still zip codes, it's still an energy, it's still memories, it's still development, it's still home, whether it's in our hearts or in the space and the land, naming streets, whether they are gone, they're never forgotten. Thank you. The question was asked, how will the proposed housing, which leads back to the question of who might want to move back, how will the proposed housing on top of the caps, and for those who've not been in conversations, building freeway caps is something many cities do to be able to leverage more land for development up above freeways. If you've been in Seattle, if you traveled up I-5 going through Seattle, the first time I went under the Seattle Convention Center and realized that all of that tonnage was hanging over me, I was a little nervous, but I was also impressed, and I marvel at engineering and development and planning that someone could conceive of and do that. If you go up there on that top of that cap, there's this beautiful convention center. There's a park. There's all kinds of public space and things that occur so that you're not just stuck with a freeway that divides a community, either that side or this side. I've been to other cities where they've reclaimed areas and where there's all kinds of activity and energy above a freeway cap. You can actually walk through, you can walk around. You don't really think about, I try not to think about that I'm standing above a freeway, however far up I am from it. So caps allow us to recapture, to reclaim area for development. And certainly that is present in the plan for housing, for entrepreneurship, for places that we visit, that we eat out, for outdoor entertainment, for cultural gathering spaces. That's what the caps do. They allow more buildable, reclaimable land and not just a freeway with the stark reality that you've lost land. So that's what we're referring to when you hear them talk about what could take place on the caps. You can build up, you reclaim more land, you have more developable land that can go to a community vision. And the question is asked, how will the proposed housing on the caps be affordable for Black community? And the questioner says, taking into account our unemployment statistics, salary gaps, healthcare gaps that will only widen by 2027 when the project is to be complete. I would love to hear an urban planner and certainly Cleo to respond to that question if there is a response that at least starts teasing out some of the points that were taken. With unemployment, with salary gaps, how would people be able to afford to come back to some of the proposed housing above the caps in Albina?
Well, to me, the question is kind of confusing because I'm not sure if housing is actually proposed on the caps. I don't think
They might have noted housing. Consider any kind of development that might be businesses, it might be educational centers. People, I think the question is, how can you come back knowing how housing prices rise? How could we return to an Albina when we were priced out or pushed out in affordability is a question in the inner city.
well, one of the things that I mean, to me, that was just comes to mind is looking at the reasons why we were pushed out. Basically, redlining, red tagging, a bunch of fraudulent, illegal procedures. So one of the things would be to rectify that. We have to rectify the policies and planning that keeps us out of an area. It's not that we can't invest, it was that we were bogusly pushed out. So, and that's one of the things that Albina Vision Trust is looking at when we talk about a 50-year plan. How do we plan, 50 years from now for a prosperous Black community to be able to participate in maintaining and being prosperous in a lifestyle that benefits us. So I would say I would end it there without because there's specifics once we get into that. We could break it down into specifics, but it's really looking at our past history and what can be done now and moving forward.
Absolutely. Anything to add?
I'll dabble in the
Uh-huh.
Go ahead.
Housing affordability conversation. I think it's super important at this point in history in Portland. And more than answer a question, I would just like to spur conversation and
Yes.
challenge everyone in here to reimagine. I think affordable is not really a good word to use because anything is affordable if you have enough money. So I think it's a point in history, especially if we're thinking about the Black community that was displaced. We have to potentially, if it hasn't been done before, establish new models for that community. So we may have to try things that have never been done in terms of making sure that our community is housed. I'm not sure what that looks like, but the only way to reverse the damage that was done, I mean, we're living in a state that literally barred Black people from coming and gave land to white people. The only real way to counter that would be to give land to Black people. That is the opposite of that oppression. So I think I don't know how realistic that is in this world and in this culture, but I challenge the group here to start to imagine new models of housing people.
And
Thank
that
you.
and that falls right back into the 50-year plan that Albina Vision is working on. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at new ways, new models, new forms of investment, community development, Black joy, all of the above.
Thank you. I also want to jump back to the chat that Donovan Smith listed. He's the vice chair at Beyond Black. You can reach out to the board at executives@beyondblackcdc.org, and that's for further information. That's particularly East County, but also the work of Beyond Black. You spoke of Black joy and all, and I think that's important for us to connect these pieces so that we have a whole or a greater whole. And then I want the question that's just come from Jeff Strength that says, having a program such as the Portland Housing Bureau's right of return program, which is called the North-Northeast Preference Waitlist Program, could give opportunity to cap land for descendants of families that were displaced from Albina. I thank you for the question, Jeff. But as one of those displaced, I call myself an Albina legacy child whose home was taken for pennies on the dollar. And then my parents also had property where Emmanuel Hospital, before it became Legacy, displaced hundreds and hundreds of people, 1/3 of whom were Black, in order to expand the campus. And so I qualified, Portland Housing Bureau notified, as one of those who could apply for the North-Northeast preference. And you've seen all the new apartments going up on Martin Luther King as far as your eye can go. And you've also seen them down Vancouver. I am a questioner of affordable housing. As Andre says, apartments are not wealth building opportunities unless you own some stake in the apartment building. The beneficiaries of this affordable housing are developers who are able to get set-asides and all kinds of incentives from our city to build these apartment buildings for people who had homes, which is property. So while I know so many people need to be housed, we have some serious issues here about housing and affordability. I probably, like Andre, think that moniker affordable housing, they are apartments. And so I don't want to get that confused with actual wealth investment opportunities for a family to pass on. They house, but the beneficiaries, especially very large companies like the one that I'm familiar with, are now in the housing business. TriMet is in the housing business with this developer. Metro is in the affordable housing business. That tells me that there's profitability for the same folks again. And that's the developers, predominantly almost majority, almost completely white developers who are now entering these opportunities to build this housing to house people that were put out. And so I think we need to carefully dissect that and even introduce, as Andre said, new models of what affordable housing is and can be. When I asked why they're not building houses, they said that in this community, they can't build any more single family homes. So I'm looking at who is now in the housing that used to belong to us, all up and down Williams and Tillamook and Thompson. And we need to figure out what to do about that in a way that is actually much more beneficial to all and not just to the same majority. That's my soapbox. I'm going to rally people to, I'm going to organize folks in affordable housing, I think. I see from Jen Lundstrom, I'm a realtor. I'm involved in a group becoming a nonprofit called Repair, Real Estate Professionals Against Institutional Racism. And they have received a 501c3, and they are going to start taking donations and fundraising in the community, the real estate community, to contribute financially to housing projects in Albina for Black families. And the email address repairoregon@gmail.com has been offered. So it's critical that we explore these opportunities. And I think also for us to unmask this terminology that sounds one way, but actually is playing out in a much more familiar historical way. Just a question and to see what the end goal really is. And we have a question, I think perhaps for Andre and others. What actual clear plans outside of politics and tokenism are there to prevent further gentrification and displacement? And my question to you, to all of you, that gentrification practices are so evident all over the country, which requires community displacement. Are there clear plans for being able to interrupt what is a pattern from Portland to New York, from Brooklyn to Atlanta to Chicago to places that are rural, more rural? Asheville, North Carolina has had an explosion of gentrification. It's happening everywhere. Portland is considered a model for it. But even in cities where our numbers, the majority BIPOC communities are large, it is happening around and on top of them. So the question is, what actual clear plans are there to prevent further gentrification and displacement? How might you entertain that question?
I
Mac,
guess
you've
I
done
can.
work. Yes, please.
I mean, I would question what a further gentrification really looks like for Portland, where we're already isolated and scattered. I'm not sure that gentrification within the city is possible any further. I think we can only end up in the rural areas, which I think is realistic. I don't think that anyone actually wants that. So I'm not sure that gentrification going forward is so much of an issue, but I do understand that if we are to try and reoccupy an area, what stops us, from falling, into the same fate. And I think that the creation of something new, a plan like this, a 50-year plan, has to account for the politics. I don't think that you can separate this issue from politics, because you know gentrification itself, it really is a product of politics. So I mean, aside from picking up baseball bats and guarding our houses, there has to be a constant, I mean, a constant presence for us, especially once we have a space. There has to be a constant a presence from us defending that space and making sure that that space is prosperous. And I think that currently we have organizations like Taking Ownership that are doing their job in trying to keep especially our older community in their homes. It's processes like that. It sounds very simple, but it's processes like that that keep our people in their homes and creating generational wealth, as opposed to getting affordable housing.
Are there others who want to lean into that question? I want to also go over to the chat. Emmanuel Williams has asked, is there any depth of correspondence between Albina Vision Trust and Legacy Emmanuel Hospital to reclaim the plot of land on Williams that was never developed? And I think before your answer, there is a group that I understand has moved from being the Williams Russell block to actually moving to be a community development corporation that has a relationship with Legacy Emmanuel for a little bit of the land they took that they would want to return, not all of it, for development. And they have been engaging now, I understand, with the community, if that's correct. And I certainly want to update my facts. engaging in a plan where housing and possible community hubs, Black community hubs are becoming very hot to others to do that kind of development that still would profit Legacy Emmanuel because there are all kinds of incentives for affordable housing, et cetera, as I mentioned before. And so would you be involved with that, or is that in fact this other group that is engaged in that practice with Emmanuel, Legacy Emmanuel?
There were a few groups engaged in um, that project working group, as well as EDPA too.
Mhm. Right.
And one of the best resources for the displacement, the amount of land that was taken, and this paltry small bit of land that's being offered back as though it's a gift, that EDPA, Emmanuel Displaced Persons, is an incredibly resourced, informed, well-researched group for the bigger picture about what has happened, what is not happening, and the history. So we have had engagement with that organization around their work to be seen and heard because they early on were raising the issues around uh, the movement and the mistreatment and the displacement of Black folks with no compensation or consideration. And so it's another resource about groups that have been working for a while. I'm just checking. Great. Donovan had put in earlier, and there's the information for contacting Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association. And we also have in the chat now, when Mac talked about taking ownership, that is also listed. So thank you for keeping up with and putting in the contact information. And again, we are recording, and so that information will be available. Anything we pull out, we, the NAACP, would put that information up so that it can be captured later for people to make contact, reach out, and to get involved. And again, the question was asking about how will the NAACP have a role in defining restorative justice? And I'm coming to you, Mac, for that one.
I feel like it's a really broad question.
It's very.
You know, in my mind, in the way that I see it, things like this are part of the process for restorative justice. If we are pushed off of our land and we're able to use politics or whatever to get our space back, that is a level of restoration. As far as restorative justice, I mean, it's such a broad question. It really, I'm a little bit boggled by it. If we mean in regards to the city, how the city has treated us, as far as how the state has treated us, as far as how we've treated each other, as far as how the neo-Nazis and things have treated us. There's a lot of things we can talk about when it comes to restorative justice. I look at the NAACP as a vehicle to have those conversations. I don't think that it's a place that we have to pretend that we have all the answers or that we can tell the future or make these predictions with any sort of accuracy in the 21st century. But I think that this is a place that we are learning to come back to our roots and stop, chasing the devil around, and instead get back to our people and have good conversations, and then take actions appropriate to those conversations. So as far as restorative justice goes, I see no difference in that. Wherever there are grievances, we are going to speak out, we are going to stand up, and we are going to facilitate and help to take action in that regard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And I always lead conversations that ask about our role. Is what our role has been for 100 years, is we don't try to define, but what we're doing is redetermining and asking community, creating spaces for us to question, to answer, and to in unity move forward, mobilize, take action so that the justice that we seek in all these arenas is actually justice realized. That is the 109-year history of the NAACP as an advocate, as an activist organization, as a protest organization, as a very focused Black liberation organization for the advancement of colored people in all the arenas of commerce and living and health and social engagement and education, that we deserve to have equal opportunity and equitable outcomes. And so I think that's restorative justice is a new term for activities and actions and the long engagement of Black people fighting first for survival and now for a revival of the opportunity to be the people and have and claim what we deserve by our labor, by our history, by our ancestry, and by our intention. I like that it was asked, and it is broad. And I think our long history in the past and certainly in the present moment suggests that we all know what the justice is that we want, and collectively, how do we get to that? Which I appreciate you, Mac, and I think others were listening as well for talking about how we get to restoring justice among ourselves as well. That there's room at a table, or we build bigger tables for our ideas, our thinking, our groups, those who've been in the fight and those who are coming to the fight new, because we have to fill the gaps and get to the place where we advance together. That's some real work. Andre?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if the author of that question is present, but I guess for the entire room, I would also invite us to think critically about what it is we are striving to restore. There's so many things. For me, regarding Albina, something that particularly stands out is land ownership. And so I think as a community, we should request a historical map of the percentage of property that was owned by Black people, in 1950. I don't know, whenever the highest peak of land ownership in Albina was of Black people, and how that has changed since. And so I think that would be something that would give us something that we could restore to. Well, hey, we want to have land ownership at the levels we had when we were thriving before you decimated our community. That's something numerical. Obviously, there are other elements that we'd like to restore as well. And also going through that restoration, imagining new futures as well. So yes, we have, huge populations of Black people in this space thriving, wonderful. And we don't want the police there as they were when we were there. You know what I'm saying? And so I think just imagining what it means to restore is going to be really important.
Thank you. Any further discussion? And there's a good question or a good concern that's been raised in the chat. I want to refer to D'Angelo says, I struggle with the continued proposal and discussion regarding nonprofits within our community. Although I do see the benefits of nonprofit organizations, the nonprofit model by design is created to keep us in a position where we are contingent on white benevolence to push our agendas forward. So that's part A of his two-part question. Responses? And audience members, if you want to put in the chat that you have responses as well, please do so while Max starts us off.
I would love to comment on that. I actually agree. I can't stand a nonprofit. I think it's a lot of bureaucracy, and like you said, it's a lot of depending on people to be benevolent and give you money and hope. And also, if it's not going the way that the city or the folks that have money wanted to go, then of course they can, like pull the purse strings, right? So I think the nonprofits definitely have a point that they're good up to. I mean, personally, I've worked in the community for a long time doing things with no nonprofit or no organization at all, and just doing the work. And I think that's also a very possible thing. I've run We Out, what's it called? We Out Here magazine with no corporation for almost 10 years. And we've done a ton of work and moved a ton of money without any issue. So there are a lot of ways to do things. But I think that if you're going to operate with certain amounts of money, if you're going to do things, that involve certain kinds of partnerships, you have to have a legal basis to do some of that work. So I think that nonprofits allow us to fill in the gaps, if you will, between the work that I feel is more real, which is the work in the streets and the work that people have to put on their backs. A lot of the work is not recorded, is not taxed, is not going through corporations. A lot of it is just being done in the street. But there's certain things you have to do that you have to have a nonprofit for in this environment.
Absolutely. I think you also raised a very good point about the legalities and the question of legitimacy in the eyes of those who monitor and who tax. And clearly, there are restrictions, intention on nonprofits from being able to organize and mobilize. And people talk about like lobbying. Well, lobbying is educating somebody on your position, but paid lobbyists get to lobby. You have to be able to avoid doing too much of the mobilizing and the lobbying of our community because that can be seen as being in conflict with your nonprofit status. And it can be yanked, of course, by the IRS. And so, how do you get around that, or how much flexibility do you have to be out in the street meeting people where they are? Is always a question and a concern for nonprofits to keep their good status and to keep the money coming. So you're correct. The second part of that question that was raised was also the question of transparency DeAngelo raised about transparency regarding how we as a community have been displaced due to the systematic and methodical plots to remove economics from our community. That's what I heard Andre speak to, and Cleo, and certainly you as well, Mac and Ken. And so I want to recognize that. How do we get beyond that lack of transparency? I think Andre called for the mapping of the wealth we had. What was the value of that wealth? And how to look at that in comparison to the significant reduction in the displacement of us from the space where we held wealth in. And perhaps you're saying, start the conversations from this point, as opposed to starting the conversation from where we are. Bring that conversation forward. This is what we had, measurable, documented. This is where we are. So how do we get to the reclaiming of that? Another different way of looking at how we move forward is what I'm understanding. Does anyone on the panel know how the Fubon market came together? Asian American large market. We need to find out what was it, and we could call on groups, particularly out in the Jade, and call on Apano to find out how they were able to engage in partnerships and relationships because they got a lot of funding to reclaim the outer east, 82nd in that area. It's worth finding out. So thank you. That's the power of having this recorded. We can't remember all of it. The forthcoming report Diana Buell has put in from EDPA2 about the wealth and the Williams-Russell prior to Emmanuel is a good starting point for what you were raising, Andre, I'm guessing. The specific call for restitution of the displacement gets to what? Curable losses. And I like that terminology, how to actually document and how to call for curable responses to the losses from that intentional displacement. Did they have to imagine an appeal to the political system, they're saying, in order to create Fubon Market? Well, yeah, upon the city, there were a number of corporations and others who leaned in once they presented a very well-developed plan for economics, for housing, for senior services, for Asian Pacific Islander community members. But we will find out and definitely be able to have that as another document. And the recording of the EDPA2's conversation on that report has been placed into the chat. I want to go to the last question from the advanced questions, and that is, how will it be determined who is the Black community of Portland? I'm guessing, and if the questioners in the conversation, that would be great. I'm going to guess that they meant when we're talking about returning to or reclaiming or being able to be actively engaged in albina again, how will it be determined who is the Black community of Portland? Any responses to that? Go
Can we have
ahead,
a
Mac.
racial draft?
Say that again.
Can we have a racial draft?
Well, I was wondering about, I've been in groups, we all have, where people do self-identification different than they've ever done before if there's going to be benefit. So, the idea of who gets to name themselves and claim themselves as Black, I don't know if it'll be the papers like were used in South Africa. That's an interesting question. There are a lot of responses to that. And certainly the NAACP doesn't have anybody pass any kind of test. We like to believe that there's an honest self-identification process. If the question is specifically about how will people be able to be a part of and reclaim themselves as part of the Black community of Portland in albina, I think that historically and currently, you know who your people are. And we know what the intent of this development and redevelopment reclamation is. And the city knows as well who we're talking about, the city and the state, when they reference the Black community that was displaced, was marginalized, was removed. So there are places, someone's reminded me about determining who is Black. If any of you remember the Oregon Cares Fund, the monies that came from the federal government to relieve the distress and the losses, employment, businesses, families from the pandemic. And a number of lawsuits were mounted against this fund, which was $62 million. I served on that fund. And we were hit with lawsuits with the intention of tying us up till the deadline, December 31st, 2020, ran out for expending the money. It was very clear, calculated, and familiar. But we had white folks who were saying, had they been Black, they could have gotten this money, 62 million out of nearly 1.2 billion, as I recall, that the state was going to receive. That was 4% based on our population in the state. And there was all of these other places where we all know that money was available and was being given to folks. So with the same kind of situation, when we self-identify as Black, then all the interesting cousins and new members of the family you never knew, who then began to come into the pool. And so I think that it is a really great question, and who decides, I guess, is as important to me as what the decision is. And there is a question to Kayan. Thank you for the link. I read both the prior BPS report as well as the magazine, but I do think it's good information to anyone that's not been made aware. And if you could respond just briefly, Kayan, to what he's referencing.
Yes, just it was a chat response to D'Angelo's comment about being more transparent about the zoning and all of the other policies that are ongoing as far as pulling wealth out of Black communities, redistribution of people, and so on. Just this summer, Cleo and I finished a zine that really kind of focuses on what our experience has been in our research, and then also personal family experience with really pushing back against that system. And it includes vocabulary, it includes things like red tagging, redlining, what blight ordinances were, a lot of really good information for research and kind of that first step into learning about a lot of these policies that need to be changed still, because they're still on the books, still on the records, and maybe not in the same specific wording or under the same title, but they are still there.
Yeah, this was pertaining to the blight nuisance ordinances that destroyed mom.
They would tag our properties or our community as having nuisance elements or being or blighted areas.
Yes.
And the federal government participated actively in that particular terminology that allowed cities to be getting funding to be able to move out communities that had significant numbers of people of color, particularly Black.
Right.
So how all of this, yeah,
All under urban renewal and slum clearance.
Right.
absolutely.
Right.
We
So it
call
really
it
does.
eminent domain, which is
Mhm.
urban removal.
Right. And it really pushes about back against that narrative that Black folks weren't able to take care of their homes and their properties. And it's not because people weren't interested in doing so. It's because maybe you couldn't get that loan to make some of the larger changes that needed to happen, or whatever other funding was not available to you because you were in a red line district.
There was a lot of disinvestment.
Mhm.
I'm going to raise now. I want to recognize that we're within about 10 minutes of our stop time. But if Lily is still paying attention to everything, if you can find the link, I wasn't sharing it before, but an article came out that Washington Post did a multi-series on across 10 states where disinvestment, where infrastructure building and all was stopped or halted or has harmed communities, poor rural communities, major cities. And here in Oregon, that I was interviewed and I talked about Albina, and it just came out in the Washington Post, which tells the larger story about the intentionality around this disinvestment and reinvestment once displacement has been completely done. And it is a very sobering, but it's also very informative for our movement forward. And I would certainly, and I hesitated because when I got the call, I thought it was a prank call and that I had been recommended. And I want to thank those. And I was so angry. And it was one of the hottest days ever. They sent a photographer here to Oregon. And I thought this is all a joke. And yet, when you see Texas and California and Oregon and North Carolina and all of these states, even New York City, transit systems and all, the intentionality around this is really kind of overwhelming. But we can do something more and better. So I want to thank everyone who joined us. I think it compels us to consider conversation 3, which would be looking at these community models of governance that are springing up, that are being talked about, that are being articulated in various communities, to look at what is community governance, to look deeper at what it takes, where it might have been tried or not, and what has been the result. And Portland likes to be first on everything. So, how about being first around community reclamation of its community governance, so that the benefits and the ownership of the community are actively engaged by the people who live there? And what would it take for the model of governance? What would a model of governance look like for us? We will keep you posted on the NAACP's decision to move that conversation. I mentioned to you that I definitely want you to know that the joint committees that are working on the I-5 project are meeting on the 31st, Tuesday, the 31st, from 4 to 7. And if you go to I-5 Rose Quarter, or if you Google that project, it will show you the meetings. They are on YouTube, but the conversation and the decision around the preferred option for the covers has to be made very shortly. And that would allow people to actually, public comments limited to 2 minutes, but you can write in, and those comments are shared with all the committee members in advance or during the meeting. And this is a way for the community to tell us what you think is the best option and why, so that we can bring that forward in the conversations. By the end of September, the recommendation has to go forth to the Department of Transportation and its executive body. Washington Post. Anything else for the good of the order? I love the idea we could get out a few minutes early. If I missed anything, you charge that to my heart. And I want to thank the panelists today, this second conversation. I really respect and honor that you were willing to join us. We want you to stay tuned. And participants, If you're interested in being involved in the conversation, if you're a planner, a community resident, if you were displaced, if you have skills, talent to offer, put it in or write to us at pdxnaacp.org and help us be able to craft the next conversation and for you to join us. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful, safe day. Be socially distanced, but not distanced from each other. Take really good care. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.